The Christmas Mystery. Today is the 3rd of December, and we are going to read the chapter for the 3rd of December, in which Elisabet continues her journey towards and today reaches the border between Norway and Sweden. Before we start reading that chapter, however, we better open our Advent calendar door. So let's go ahead and do that and see the character for today. The 3rd of December. It's a little lamb. So we'll put the lamb up here next to the angel Ephiriel. The 3rd of December. I don't know if you can see that, but we've got a man in an old-fashioned car driving along, like running before the wind, or like rushing down a moving staircase. Joachim woke up early in the morning of the 3rd of December. The Donald Duck clock that hung above his desk said 7:15. So there was still half an hour to go until Mama and Papa's usual waking time. He remembered that he'd dreamt about something strange, but he was not quite sure what. It had been something to do with the angel Ephiriel and the lamb. He pulled himself up in bed and peered up at the magic Advent calendar. At the top of the picture, several angels were floating down through the clouds in the sky. One of them was blowing a trumpet. That was to wake up all the sheep and the shepherds, of course. Joachim imagined that the angel on the right of the picture must be Ephiriel. He was just as Joachim had thought Ephiriel might look, and he was smiling at Joachim, raising an arm as if he was trying to wave to him. The angel seemed clearer than yesterday. Joachim got to his feet on the bed and opened the door with the number 3 on it. He saw a tiny little picture of a vintage car. He had seen that kind of old car once when he went to the Technical Museum with Grandpa. Joachim didn't understand what a vintage car could have to do with Christmas, but then he picked up the little piece of paper that had fallen out of the calendar and down onto his pillow. He snuggled down under the duvet and read what was written on the sheet. The second sheep. Elisabet and the angel Ephiriel ran on after the lamb. Soon they had left the wood behind and were going down a narrow country lane. In the distance, thick smoke was rising from some tall factory chimneys. "There's a town," said Elisabet. "That's Halden," explained the angel. "We're quite close to Sweden." Suddenly they heard a clatter right behind them. Elisabet turned and saw an old car driving towards them. Driving the car was a man with a hat and coat and a black beard who looked a bit like the picture of Great-Grandpa on the mantelpiece at home. As he passed, the man sounded the horn and doffed his hat. "That car must be terribly old," exclaimed Elisabet. "On the contrary, I think it was probably brand new," said Ephiriel. "I always thought angels were much cleverer than humans, but you don't seem to know much about cars," said Elisabet, sighing in frustration. But she didn't want to argue with the angel, so she went on. "But I suppose you don't drive cars in heaven. I expect God has forbidden any kind of pollution." Ephiriel tried to hide a laugh. He pointed to a pile of logs. "Sit down here," he said. "You deserve a short rest, and there's something important I have to tell you about our journey to Bethlehem." Elisabet sat down and looked at the angel. "Don't you get tired too?" she asked. The angel shook his head. "No, angels don't get tired. We're not made of flesh and blood. It's flesh and blood that get tired." Elisabet felt a bit embarrassed. Of course, angels didn't get tired. If they did, they wouldn't have the strength to fly up and down between heaven and earth. "Now, can you tell me exactly where we are going, my dear?" asked the angel. "To Bethlehem," replied Elisabet. "And what are we going to do there?" "We're going to stroke the lamb, I suppose." The angel nodded. "And we'll also welcome the baby Jesus into the world. He was called God's Lamb because he was just as kind and innocent as the little lamb's fleece is soft. We have to travel 2,000 years backwards in time to the moment when Jesus was born." Elisabet put her hand to her mouth. "But isn't it impossible to travel backwards in time?" she asked. "Not at all," said Ephiriel. "Nothing is impossible for God, and I am here as God's messenger. We have a small part of the journey behind us already. Down there you see Halden, and we have arrived back at the beginning of the 20th century. Do you understand?" "I think so," said Elisabet. "And that means the car wasn't old after all." "No, it may have been brand new. I'm sure you noticed how proud the driver was when he sounded his horn. Not very many people owned cars then." Elisabet simply sat and stared, and Ephiriel continued. "Since you began running after the lamb, more than 50 years have gone by. We are running to Bethlehem through time, going downhill through history on a diagonal line. It's like running before the wind or rushing down a moving staircase." Elisabet nodded. She wasn't sure she understood everything the angel was saying, but she knew how clever it all was. "How do you know we're at the beginning of the 20th century? The angel raised his arm and pointed at a gold watch on his wrist, decorated with a row of shining pearls. On its face it said, 1916. "It's an angel watch," he explained. "It isn't quite as accurate as other watches, but in heaven we're not too particular about all the hours and minutes." "Why not?" "We have the whole of eternity to see to," replied the angel. "And anyway, we never have to catch a bus to get to work on time." Now Elisabet understood why the church clock had only struck 3, even though it had been 6 or 7 o'clock when she ran from the shop, and why the snow had disappeared, and it had suddenly become summer. She had run backwards in time. "You began running along the diagonal path as soon as you started chasing the lamb," continued the angel Ephiriel. "That's when the long journey through time and space began." Another car approached them from the opposite direction, leaving a cloud of dust and sand behind that made Elisabet cough. When the dust cloud had settled, she pointed up at the road. "There's our lamb again. But look, now there's a grown sheep as well." The angel nodded. "Verily I say unto you, that sheep is going to Bethlehem too." With that they began to run. When Elisabet and Ephiriel had caught up with the lamb and the sheep, both of them bounded on as well. "Lambkin, lambkin," coaxed Elisabet. But the lamb and the sheep would not be coaxed into standing still. They were going to Bethlehem. To Bethlehem. They passed the outskirts of Halden and paused for a moment to look down at all the people walking in the streets and the market. The ladies were wearing long, colorful cotton dresses and large hats in different colors. Several cars were sputtering along the streets, but there were horses and carriages as well. They left it behind them and soon came to a frontier station. A large signboard announced, "Frontier, Sweden." Elisabet was brought up short. "Do you think we'll be allowed to go into Sweden?" The angel fluttered around her like an overgrown butterfly. "They won't dare to stop a pilgrimage," he replied. "Besides, it's only a few weeks since Norway had the same king as Sweden." May I look at your angel watch again?" Ephiriel stretched out his arm. The watch said 1905. Then they sped past 2 frontier guards, the lamb and the sheep first, and Elisabet and the angel Ephiriel just behind them. "Halt!" shouted the frontier guard. "In the name of the law!" But they were already far into Sweden, and they had come a few years closer to the birth of Jesus. Joachim sat up in bed. So that was why there was a picture of an old car in the Advent calendar. That was why it had suddenly become summer, too. Joachim made haste to lock the piece of paper with the story about Elisabet and Ephiriel into the secret box in case Mama and Papa came into the bedroom. Afterwards he sat for a long time thinking over what he had read. Joachim was old enough to know that you can't really run backwards in time, but at least you can do it in your thoughts. At school he had heard that 1,000 years to mankind can seem like one single day to God, and the angel Ephiriel had told Elisabet that nothing is impossible for God. Could Elisabet and the angel really have run backwards in time? Soon he heard Mama on the landing. She opened the door to his room and asked, "Have you opened the Advent calendar?" He nodded, and Mama leaned over the calendar. "A vintage car!" she exclaimed. She sounded a bit surprised, almost disappointed. Perhaps she thought there ought to be pictures of angels and Christmassy things every day. "It's because Elisabet and the angel Ephiriel have run to Sweden at the time when cars like that were brand new," said Joachim. "They're going to run all the way to Bethlehem." "I think you're a real little storyteller," replied Mama, patting him on the head. She went into the bathroom. Joachim felt a tickle in his tummy when he thought of all the clever things he knew that Mama and Papa believed he was just making up. He decided on something even more clever. On Christmas Eve, he'd put together all the pieces of paper that had come from the magic Advent calendar and place the packet under the Christmas tree. Then he would write, "To the best Mama and Papa in the world," on the outside of the packet. It was a pity he had had this idea, because it made him look forward to Christmas even more. And although it was fun to have something to look forward to, it was boring to have to wait so long. When Joachim looked forward to something exciting, it almost gave him a headache. That afternoon, Papa complained that he still hadn't found his driving license. "In that case, he wasn't really allowed to drive," said Mama. But when Papa heard that, He snorted like a steam engine. And that's the end of the 3rd of December.